All right, so we've got a lot to unpack today.
Yeah.
This motorcycle accident in Kowloon Bay yesterday, on the surface, it looks like just another traffic stop gone wrong. But then you add in this whole other element with the off-duty customs officer.
Yeah, the off-duty officer element, I think, is what makes this really interesting.
Definitely. Trying to stop a motorcycle by, standing in the middle of the road.
Yeah. I mean, was he trying to be a hero? Did he overstep?
Totally. And did the motorcyclist even realize what was happening? Were they trying to evade police?
I mean, think about it. You're on a motorcycle. You see someone step out in front of you.
What's your first instinct? To swerve.
Exactly. So was this a reckless act?
Or a tragic misunderstanding?
Yeah, we got to look at this from all sides.
Absolutely. Before we get into, the could-haves and should-haves, though, let's just lay out the facts as we know them so far.
Absolutely. So we know the motorcyclist was being pursued by a traffic officer, lights and siren, the whole 9 yards.
Right. Routine traffic stop, so it seems. Then this off-duty customs officer enters the scene.
Yeah, and according to reports, he steps right into the road, directly into the path of the motorcycle.
The motorcyclist swerves, loses control, crashes into a pole, and then a tree.
Wow.
Yeah. And we're talking a really bad crash. The motorcycle actually broke into 2 pieces.
Oh, gosh.
The rider's helmet came off.
Oh, no.
And tragically, he was pronounced dead at the scene.
It's heartbreaking. And, it raises the question, was this just a terrible accident, or did the officer's actions directly contribute to the fatality?
Exactly. And like we said, there are already some very different opinions on this out there. The victim's friend, he's obviously devastated, and he's been very vocal.
Yeah.
He says that the customs officer basically committed murder. He's adamant that the motorcyclist was driving normally, no crazy speeding or anything, and had zero intention of hitting the officer. He just reacted instinctively when someone suddenly stepped in front of him.
Makes sense. I mean, it's fight or flight, right?
Totally. But then we have the police report, and they're saying the motorcyclist might have been speeding 60, maybe even 70 kilometers an hour in a 50 zone.
So potentially exceeding the speed limit.
Yeah. And to make things even more complicated, the police report also mentions that the officer himself was injured during the incident.
So there was some kind of contact.
So on one hand, we have this picture of a guy just enjoying a ride, maybe going a little fast, but not doing anything crazy. And then suddenly someone jumps out in front of him and he crashes.
And on the other hand, you have a law enforcement officer potentially trying to prevent something worse from happening.
Maybe he thought the motorcyclist was a danger to others.
But also putting himself at risk, getting injured in the process.
It's messy.
Yeah, big time. And of course, the big question is, was the motorcyclist's death solely caused by the crash? Or did the officer's actions play a role?
Right, and I think what makes this even more complicated is the fact that the officer wasn't even on duty. So, legally speaking, did he have any right to intervene in the first place?
Excellent point. And that's something we need to explore. Did he overstep his bounds? What are the legal and ethical implications of intervening in a situation like that when you're not officially on duty? I mean, off duty, you're essentially just a civilian, right?
Right, and I think that's what's sparking a lot of debate and anger, especially within the motorcycling community. I mean, many are saying this is a totally unnecessary escalation, that it was reckless and had fatal consequences.
It definitely brings up a lot of questions about the use of force, appropriate response, and the limits of civilian intervention. It's a really tricky situation and a lot to unpack.
Yeah, not just about what happened in those few seconds, but about the bigger picture as well. What does this mean for law enforcement, public safety, and even just for everyday people who might find themselves in a similar situation?
Absolutely.
But before we go there, I think it's really important to talk about the potential consequences for the officer himself.
Right. Even though he wasn't on duty, his actions are being scrutinized.
Big time.
I mean, the police are investigating. I'm sure Customs will do their own internal review.
Right.
And depending on what they find, he could face a range of consequences. We're talking everything from disciplinary action within Customs to even potential legal repercussions.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. What do we mean by legal repercussions?
Yeah.
Could he actually face criminal charges?
It's possible. It all comes down to whether his actions are deemed to have directly contributed to the motorcyclist's death.
Right.
If so, you could be looking at charges like manslaughter, potentially even murder, depending on the circumstances.
Right.
And even if he doesn't face criminal charges, the family of the motorcyclist could still file a civil suit. Wrongful death, things like that.
So a lot of legal complexities to consider.
Absolutely. And to understand that, we need to delve into some legal concepts like duty to rescue, negligence, and causation.
All right, well, let's do it. Let's unpack all of that after the break. And this whole duty to rescue thing, we were talking about that before the break.
Right.
You said he wasn't obligated to intervene, but
Right.
does that change? Because he did. I mean, if he hadn't gotten involved, maybe.
Well, that's the million-dollar question. Legally speaking, most places don't force you to be a hero, right? There's no law that says you have to put yourself in danger to save someone.
Okay, so no Good Samaritan law or anything?
Not in a general sense, no. But
There are exceptions.
Always exceptions. Like, if you caused the dangerous situation in the first place.
So if he created a hazard by stepping into the road.
Exactly. Could be argued that he triggered a duty to rescue.
Even though he was trying to help.
That's the tricky part. The law doesn't always care about your intentions. It's about the outcome. And in this case, the outcome was tragic.
Man, that's tough. It's like damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah. And remember, I'm not saying this is how it'll play out in court.
Right.
Just something that investigators and lawyers will likely look into. Did his actions make things riskier for the motorcyclist? And if so, was he then legally obligated to minimize that risk?
Wow.
It's a real gray area.
It is. It makes you think, right, about all those split-second decisions and, like you said, those unintended consequences.
Absolutely.
And then there's the whole thing about him being off-duty. If he'd been in uniform, responding to a call.
Yeah, if he was on duty, it'd be a whole different ballgame. Clear procedures, guidelines for pursuits.
Training, all that.
Yes. This is way more complicated. It blurs the line between civilian and law enforcement.
And it brings up a whole other issue. How much should off-duty officers get involved? I mean, especially in a situation that can change so quickly.
That's a debate for sure, one that I don't think has an easy answer.
Yeah, absolutely. We have been talking a lot about the legal stuff, but we can't forget that this was a real person. This motorcyclist had family, friends. He had a life.
Absolutely. It's easy to get caught up in the legal aspects, but at the end of the day, a young man lost his life.
And the impact of that ripples out.
It does. It affects everyone.
I was reading about how his friend described him. A gentle person, he said. Loved riding. He just bought that motorcycle recently, too.
Makes it even more tragic.
It does. And I think it's also brought up a lot of feelings, especially within the motorcycling community.
Of course.
About how they're perceived, how they're treated. Some feel like they're always being targeted.
It's a valid concern. And this incident, sadly, just adds fuel to that fire.
Yeah. Anytime you have a situation like this, with law enforcement involved in a fatal accident with a motorcyclist, questions get raised about bias, about training, about how these encounters are handled.
It's inevitable. And this case is definitely going to put all of that under a microscope.
So back to the officer for a second. We talked about criminal charges. We talked about civil liability.
Right.
What about his job? What could customs do?
Well, they have their own internal systems. Like any law enforcement agency, they have ways of dealing with these kinds of situations.
Right.
So they could reprimand him, could suspend him, maybe even fire him.
Depending on how serious.
Depends on what their investigation finds. Did he violate any policies? Did he act improperly? All of that will come into play.
Man, it feels like there are so many moving parts to this whole thing.
There are.
The officer's intentions, what the motorcyclist was doing, the speed he was going, this whole legal thing about duty to rescue.
It's complex.
Potential bias, off-duty intervention. It's a lot. How do you even begin to make sense of all of it?
It's a challenge. There's no simple answer. It's not a black and white situation.
Yeah.
But I think by looking at each piece, by considering all the different sides and legal arguments, we can start to understand what happened and why.
You said earlier that this case forces us to face some hard truths. What are those truths, and how do we as a society move forward from something like this in a way that's fair?
Well, one truth is that good intentions don't always equal good outcomes. You can do something meaning well, and it can still end badly.
Oof.
Another is that our legal system, it's meant to provide justice, but sometimes it struggles with those messy situations where there's no clear-cut bad guy.
Right, because this isn't like a typical crime, right?
It's not. It's way more nuanced than that. And then maybe the hardest truth to face is that bias, whether we realize it or not, can affect how we see things, how we react, especially when it comes to law enforcement.
Yeah. Heavy stuff.
It is.
And there are a lot of emotions surrounding this incident. Anger, sadness, confusion, protests, calls for justice. How do we, as a society, have these tough conversations in a way that's productive, respectful, even when people disagree.
That's the key, isn't it? Finding a way to talk about these things, to listen to each other, even when it's hard.
Yeah, it's hard. But it's important, right, to have these conversations.
Absolutely. I think it starts with empathy, really trying to understand where the other person is coming from, even if you don't agree with them.
And be open to changing your mind.
Exactly. You got to be willing to listen and to learn and to admit when you're wrong.
Because if we just shut down or get defensive,
right, nobody wins.
Nobody wins.
And nothing changes.
And we need change. We need to have these tough conversations, not just in courtrooms or in government.
Yeah.
But like you said, at home, in our communities, online.
Everywhere. We have to be willing to talk about these issues.
And to listen.
And to listen. So as we wrap up our deep dive on this case, what are some of the big things you hope people take away from this?
Well, I think the main thing is that it's complicated. There are rarely easy answers when you're dealing with something like this.
Right. It's not always clear-cut who's right and who's wrong.
Exactly. And it's easy to get caught up in assigning blame. But the reality is, it's usually way more nuanced than that.
It's like we want to point fingers. We want someone to be the bad guy.
It's human nature, I think. But sometimes there isn't a bad guy. Sometimes it's just a series of events and decisions that lead to a tragic outcome. And like we talked about, even good intentions can go wrong.
Oh, absolutely. That's a big takeaway for me. That you can do something thinking you're helping, thinking you're doing the right thing, and it can still end in disaster.
Sobering thought.
It is, and I think it highlights how important it is to keep having these discussions about the role of law enforcement, about when it's okay for civilians to intervene, about the systemic issues that contribute to tragedies like this.
It feels like this case has really made us think about those gray areas, right? Where the lines get blurry, like justice, responsibility, intervention.
Totally. It's messy, but it's important.
It is. And it's a good reminder that these aren't just theoretical concepts we're talking about. These are real lives, real people, real consequences.
Well said. It's about recognizing the human impact of all of this.
And on that note, we want to thank you for listening to this deep dive. It's been a heavy one, we know, but we hope it sparks some thought, some reflection, maybe even some conversations.
Yeah, keep the conversation going.
Exactly. Because it's through talking, through thinking critically, through really trying to understand each other, that we can start to make a difference. This is the Deep Dive. Signing off.